What makes this story great? In episode 2 of this series, we're looking at the opening of Great Expectations, a novel by the English writer and social critic Charles Dickens, published in 1861. We're going to read the opening pages together, then explore some of the language, then I'll show you where you can find out more. This part is set in the Kent Marshes, and we start in a graveyard. Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, Chapter 1. My father's family name being Pirrip, and my Christian name Philip, my infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip, and came to be called Pip. I give Pirrip as my father's family name, on the authority of his tombstone, and my sister, Mrs. Joe Gargery, who married the blacksmith. As I never saw my father or my mother, and never saw any likeness of either of them, for their days were long before the days of photographs, my first fancies regarding what they were like were unreasonably derived from their tombstones. The shape of the letters on my father's gave me an odd idea that he was a square, stout, dark man with curly black hair. From the character and turn of the inscription, also Georgiana, wife of the above, I drew a childish conclusion that my mother was freckled and sickly. To 5 little stone lozenges, each about 1.5 feet long, which were arranged in a neat row beside their grave, and were sacred to the memory of 5 little brothers of mine, who gave up trying to get a living exceedingly early in that universal struggle, I am indebted for a belief I religiously entertained that they had all been born on their backs with their hands in their trouser pockets, and had never taken them out in this state of existence. Ours was the marsh country, down by the river within, as the river wound, 20 miles of the sea. My first, most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable raw afternoon towards evening. At such a time I found out for certain that this bleak place, overgrown with nettles, was the churchyard, and that Philip Pirrip, late of this parish, and also Georgiana, wife of the above, were dead and buried, and that Alexander, Bartholomew, Abraham, Tobias, and Roger, infant children of the aforesaid, were also dead and buried, and that the dark, flat wilderness beyond the churchyard, intersected with dykes and mounds and gates, with scattered cattle feeding on it, was the marshes, and that the low leaden line beyond was the river, and that the distant savage lair from which the wind was rushing was the sea, and that the small bundle of shivers, growing afraid of it all and beginning to cry, was Pip. "Hold your noise," cried a terrible voice, as a man started up from among the graves at the side of the church porch. "Keep still, you little devil, or I'll cut your throat." A fearful man, all in coarse grey, with a great iron on his leg, a man with no hat, and with broken shoes, and with an old rag tied around his head, a man who had been soaked in water, and smothered in mud, and lamed by stones, and cut by flints, and stung by nettles, and torn by briars, who limped and shivered and glared and growled, and whose teeth chattered in his head as he seized me by the chin. "Oh, don't cut my throat, sir," I pleaded in terror. "Pray don't do it, sir." "Tell us your name," said the man. "Quick!" "Pip, sir." "Once more," said the man, glaring at me. "Give it mouth." Pip, sir." "Show us where you live," said the man. "Point out the place." I pointed to where our village lay, on the flat inshore among the alder trees and pollards, 1 mile or more from the church. The man, after looking at me for a moment, turned me upside down and emptied my pockets. There was nothing in them but a piece of bread. When the church came to itself, for he was so sudden and strong that he made it go head over heels before me, and I saw the steeple under my feet. When the church came to itself, I say, I was seated on a high tombstone, trembling, while he ate the bread ravenously. "You young dog," said the man, licking his lips. "What fat cheeks you got." I believe they were fat, though I was at the time undersized for my years, and not strong. "Darn me if I couldn't eat 'em," said the man, with a threatening shake of his head, "and if I hadn't half a mind to it." I earnestly expressed my hope that he wouldn't, and held tighter to the tombstone on which he had put me, partly to keep myself upon it, partly to keep myself from crying. "Now look here," said the man. "Where's your mother?" "There, sir," said I. He started, made a short run, and stopped and looked over his shoulder. "There, sir," I timidly explained. "Also Georgiana. That's my mother." "Oh," said he, coming back. "And is that your father, along of your mother?" "Yes, sir," I said. "Him too, late of this parish." "Ah," he muttered then, considering. "Who d'you live with, supposing you're kindly let to live, which I ain't made up my mind about?" "My sister, sir, Mrs. Joe Gargery." Wife of Joe Gargery, the blacksmith, sir." "Blacksmith, eh?" said he, and looked down at his leg. After darkly looking at his leg and me several times, he came closer to my tombstone, took me by both arms, and tilted me back as far as he could hold me, so that his eyes looked most powerfully down into mine, and mine looked most helplessly up into his. "Now look here," he said, question being whether you're to be let to live. "You know what a file is?" "Yes, sir." "And you know what whittles is?" "Yes, sir." After each question he tilted me over a little more so as to give me a greater sense of helplessness and danger. "You get me a file." He tilted me again. "And you get me whittles." He tilted me again. "You bring 'em both to me." He tilted me again. "Or I'll have your heart and liver out." He tilted me again. I was dreadfully frightened, and so giddy that I clung to him with both hands, and said, "If you would kindly please to let me keep upright, sir, perhaps I shouldn't be sick, and perhaps I could attend more." He gave me a most tremendous dip and roll so that the church jumped over its own weathercock. Then he held me by the arms in an upright position on the top of the stone, and went on in these fearful terms. "You bring me tomorrow morning early that file and them whittles. You bring the lot to me at that old battery over yonder. And you never dare to say a word or dare to make a sign concerning your having seen such a person as me, or any person somever, and you shall be let to live. You fail, or you go from my words in any particular, no matter how small it is, and your heart and your liver shall be tore out, roasted and et. Now I ain't alone, as you may think I am. There's a young man hid with me, in comparison with which young man I am an angel. That young man hears the words I speak. That young man has a secret way peculiar to himself of getting at a boy, and at his heart, and at his liver. It's in vain for a boy to attempt to hide himself from that young man. A boy may lock his door, may be warm in bed, may tuck himself up, may draw the clothes over his head, may think himself comfortable and safe, but that young man will softly creep his way to him and tear him open. I am a-keeping that young man from harming you at the present moment with great difficulty. I find it very hard to hold that young man off your inside. Now what d'ye say?" I said that I would get him the file, and I would get him what broken bits of food I could, and I would come to him in the battery early in the morning. "Say, Lord strike you dead if you don't," said the man. I said so, and he took me down. "Now," he pursued, "you remember what you've undertook, and you remember that young man, and you get home." Good night, sir," I faltered. "Much of that," said he, glancing about him over the cold, wet flat. "I wish I was a frog, or a eel." At the same time he hugged his shuddering body in both his arms, clasping himself, as if to hold himself together, and limped towards the low church wall. As I saw him go, picking his way among the nettles and among the brambles that bound the green mounds, he looked in my eyes as if he were eluding the hands of the dead people stretching up cautiously out of their graves to get a twist upon his ankle and pull him in. When he came to the low church wall, he got over it, like a man whose legs were numbed and stiff, and then he turned round to look for me. When I saw him turning, I set my face towards home and made the best use of my legs. But presently I looked over my shoulder and saw him going on again towards the river, still hugging himself in both arms and picking his way with his sore feet among the great stones dropped into the marshes here and there for stepping places when the rains were heavy or the tide was in. The marshes were just a long, black, horizontal line then, as I stopped to look after him, and the river was just another horizontal line, not nearly so broad, nor yet so black, and the sky was just a row of long, angry red lines and dense black lines intermixed. On the edge of the river I could faintly make out the only two black things in all the prospect that seemed to be standing upright. One of these was the beacon by which the sailors steered, like an unhooped cask upon a pole, an ugly thing when you were near it. The other, a gibbet, with some chains hanging to it, which had once held a pirate. The man was limping on towards this latter, as if he were the pirate come to life, and come down and gone back to hook himself up again. It gave me a terrible turn when I thought so, and as I saw the cattle lifting their heads to gaze after him, I wondered whether they thought so too. I looked all around for the horrible young man, and could see no signs of him, but now I was frightened again, and ran home without stopping. That was the opening to Great Expectations. Feel free to pause the video and think about your first impressions, any feelings or images or any questions that you have at this point. If you've had a chance to think about your first impressions, let's take a closer look. As you can see, the novel opens with a first-person narrator introducing himself, looking back at his life, and focusing on a particularly memorable incident that happened to him in childhood. His name is Pip, and he establishes that he is an orphan. This of course makes us feel sorry for Pip, but there's also humour in his description of his father and mother and his brothers. He doesn't remember them, but he's able to imagine what they might have looked like based on their tombstones. Things soon take a darker turn as Pip describes a terrifying encounter with a stranger. The setting for this encounter is a bleak, overgrown place. It's wild, it's full of obstacles, overgrown with nettles, a dark, flat wilderness full of dikes and mounds and gates. The way the river, the sea and the wind are described as if it's one large, savage, roaring mass. And Pip, in contrast, is described as a small bundle of shivers, afraid and crying. This makes him seem more like a newborn baby rather than a small child, which also establishes how isolated and lonely and vulnerable he is. In this sense, this moment is also almost amorphous. It's like a memory. It feels almost unreal. The marshes are described as a low leaden line, and the sea and the wind and the sky all seem to be the same thing. And this is further emphasised by the idea of the marshland itself. It's neither completely solid nor completely liquid. It's quite unstable and muddy and foggy and misty and very, very cold. So it's quite bleak, but also very atmospheric and ominous, and thus appropriate because of what happens next. And what happens next? Pip meets a stranger who starts up from among the graves. I mean, he seems more like a monster or a zombie than a man. The stranger swiftly calls him a little devil and threatens to cut his throat. Clearly this is terrifying for young Pip, and this is emphasised in the description of the man. He's dressed in coarse grey, with an iron on his leg. He has no hat, he has broken shoes, and he has an old rag tied around his head. I mean, he doesn't resemble a man at all, not one that Pip would have recognised. He seems more like a monster. The passage goes on to describe him as soaked in water, smothered in mud, and lamed by stones, and cut by flints, and stung by nettles, and torn by briars. It's a great example of the use of lists to build up this image that doesn't make sense. He seems more like an animal. And that's further emphasised by the description of his physical movements. He limps and shivers and glares and growls. What he is, of course, is an escaped convict. The great iron on his leg is a giveaway, and then he asks Pip for a file and some food. The description of him rushing away from Pip further builds up the idea of the convict as someone alien to Pip, not like any man he's ever met before. He looks to Pip as if he's eluding the hands of the dead people stretching up out of their graves to grab his ankle and pull him in. Another really spooky and supernatural image. This also emphasises the desperation of the convict, and there are some clues here that show that he might also be, like Pip, a figure to sympathise with. His teeth chatter in his head. He's reflective when Pip reveals that he's an orphan. He's clearly hungry and desperate. All he asks for is a file, once he finds out Pip is related to a blacksmith, and for food. The close of the chapter reinforces some of this imagery and also widens the gaze and introduces related themes. As the sun sets, the marshes are a long black horizontal line as Pip watches after the convict. The river is also just another horizontal line, and the sky is a row of long, angry red lines and dense black lines intermixed. The viewpoint here seems to be contracting, and this raises the idea of traps, or prisons, and thus the lines could also symbolise prison bars. In fact, the only things that Pip can see clearly in the distance are a beacon by which the sailors steered, but that looks more like an unhooped cask, an ugly thing. And the other thing that Pip can see is a gibbet with chains hanging to it, which had once held a pirate. This clearly emphasises the idea of prisons and traps, and also a particular crime that's associated with pirates, the idea of theft. The contrast of a beacon of safety for sailors with an instrument of captivity and torture, the gibbet, also raises the opposition of life and death, of safety and danger. And these are themes that are explored later in the novel. So those were some thoughts on Charles Dickens' use of language in his novel Great Expectations. If you'd like to read the rest of the novel, it's available as a free ebook on places like Project Gutenberg or from libraries and bookstores. If you want to check out some of Dickens's other stories, you are in for a treat because he wrote loads. I recommend A Christmas Carol, which introduced the world to Ebenezer Scrooge, who is transformed from a miserly and cruel person to someone more loving and interested in giving back to society. Or if you want something more like Great Expectations in the form of a first-person narrator and a coming-of-age story, also known as a Bildungsroman, then you might want to check out David Copperfield. That's all for this episode, but please like this video if you did and subscribe if you'd like more. More from me next week. In the meantime, happy reading.